Pamela Phillips thought she could get away with murder, but the trail of evidence led right back to her and her co-conspirator. What started with a car bomb murder led to one of the most high-profile cases in Arizona. Welcome to Courtroom Autopsy. My name is David. This is Ryan. We're criminal lawyers who break down cases so that you understand exactly what happened in the courtroom. Today we're talking about the case of the murder of Gary Triano and how that case led the defense to point the finger at everyone else except the defendant seated in the courtroom. Let's start the autopsy.
All right, well, here we are today talking about State versus Phillips. Pamela Phillips accused of murdering her ex-husband, Gary Triano. They lived in the Tucson area in Arizona. We haven't really done cases out of Tucson, I don't think so
Not
much.
a lot, no.
Yeah. So our firm is here in downtown Phoenix. We go statewide, but it seems like most of the bigger cases that we've done have been in Phoenix. Actually, we've done a couple that were up in kind of Payson, Flagstaff area as well.
Right.
So this is a really interesting case. I think one of the biggest things about it and why it's so sensational is how the murder was carried out, right?
Totally.
You had Gary Triano. We'll talk a little bit about him. He was a real character, but he played a round of golf, got into his car, and it blew up. And he was killed with a car bomb, which you don't see a lot. Especially later, it was found out or accused that it was his ex-wife who had orchestrated this whole thing to have him murdered.
Yeah, really a wild story. So, we'll roll back the clock to November 1996. As you said, Gary Triano. Let's talk about him a little bit. Businessman, entrepreneur, real successful guy for a lot of years. Made a lot of money.
Real estate mostly.
Real estate and other investments. And then in the kind of early 90s, had a real downturn in his financial picture. He had married Pamela Phillips. They had a couple of kids together. Gary had children from other relationships as well. Doing well, and then things kind of took a turn. The couple ended up getting divorced. They were divorced at the time of his death. And Gary got involved with a lot of different players. He was involved with other businessmen, other entrepreneurs, other investors, the mafia, or some sort of crime element, and people who I think felt cheated, felt like Gary had run off with their money or lost them lots of money. And so there were a number of people who potentially could have been suspects, and certainly the police looked into lots of people who potentially could have carried this out.
Yeah, and it seemed to kind of match a mob hit, right? Like you've heard of car bombs. That kind of sounds like
this is straight out of the
mob
Godfather,
hit, right?
A car blows up, guy is dead. We got to figure out who done it.
Yeah, and it's different accounts said that he owed $26 million. This was 1996 to some people. There was another account that he owed up to $40 million to people. There was a recent incident where he had been forced out, apparently, of a casino deal that was, I think, on native land.
That's right.
And that he'd lost out on. So he'd fallen on some really tough times. The divorce itself was really contentious as that came out, which as it often is, but there were fights over custody. Eventually, Pamela had gained custody of the kids. Also, as people kind of dug a little bit further back, there were kind of, I don't know what it is people want to see people's backgrounds, but apparently Gary was married at the time that he met Pamela. She had kind of come in on the scene. She was trying to get into commercial real estate. He was, a big shot at the time. They met at some party. Several months later, he's divorced. They're married.
And very quickly. I
Yeah.
mean, the whole process of them getting together was a pretty quick thing. After the divorce, she moves to Colorado, Aspen, Colorado. In fact, that's where she is at the time of his death, which gives her a terrific alibi. I'm not even in the state, okay? So, a couple more details about the murder. It was at the La Paloma Golf Club in Tucson,
Which we've been to.
which I've been to. You've been to.
They actually have prosecutor conferences there, right?
Right, at the resort, at the hotel. But yeah, that same beautiful area of Tucson, really, a nice part of that valley at the foothills. So November 1996, he had just finished a round of golf, goes and gets in his car, and the car explodes.
And apparently that was his schedule. People knew, and it wasn't that much of a secret. Many people knew every Friday he played a round of golf, and in the afternoon and went home at La Paloma and then left. So people knew where his car was. Also, I'd heard accounts that he never locked his car, and people knew that. So very likely somebody he walks in, and apparently it was in some type of canvas
like a gym
bag
or something.
And that he had gone in. Also, it was his birthday that day.
I didn't know that.
Yes, and so they figure maybe he thought somebody had just
Left him a gift.
Yeah, left him a gift.
Well, they did leave him a gift.
Yeah, not a good one. And so, yeah, it's kind of speculation, obviously, but it was an interesting fact that it was his birthday.
And that device was a pretty rudimentary device. From what I understood, it was essentially a pipe bomb filled with black powder, gunpowder, attached to an electronic detonation from a battery. And what the investigators had discovered was that this device was remotely detonated, which
close range.
means the killer or whoever set off the device was nearby, watched him get in his car, hit the button, it explodes, and I assume that person then hightails it out of there.
Because that's one of your questions. When you hear about a pipe bomb left in somebody's car and it explodes at just the right moment, I mean, how many things could go wrong that wouldn't work? And the other piece was that it was exceptionally powerful, that there were calls to 911 for 10 miles.
Yeah, blew the roof off his car.
They could see, completely peeled it off. They said they found his windshield hundreds of yards away. Just a massive explosion.
And he's killed instantly, of course. And so then the search becomes, who done it? Now, going back to what we had said earlier about Gary's ties, it gave lots of people motive, opportunity, reasons to do him in, including people who may have been involved in organized crime or investors or others. And so police are searching, trying to figure out which of these people, organizations may have done it. And eventually, it took them years, but eventually, well, of course, let me pause for a second. They talk to Pamela. They go and visit her. They meet with her in Aspen. They speak with her. Even though she is suspicious, or, she's a potential suspect, she's a state away and, has really a pretty good alibi at first.
Yeah, really no reason to suspect her at that point, right?
Yeah.
And in my understanding is that when that first came out, it was basically an investigator or a detective from California who'd reached out to the police department in Tucson and said, hey, I'm investigating a fraud case that I think might be connected to this murder case that you guys are talking about.
And that's right. And that's where, the paths of this guy, Young, Ron Young, and Pamela Phillips intertwine. There in Colorado, apparently Young was defrauding a number of different people, including Pamela. But when Pamela is, talked to in her role as a victim, she kind of backpedals and doesn't want to aid in prosecution. And then,
Well, let's back that up for a second.
Go ahead.
So just to be clear, and I'm not sure, maybe you said this. So we're talking about the investigation in Colorado, totally
That's
separate.
right, in Colorado.
Of frauds
of Young.
that Ronald Young is conducting. She has reported him to
That's
the
right.
police for defrauding her, I believe, of $300,000, something like that. They go to her, and then that's what you're saying. It's not the Tucson police where she backs away. It's actually in this fraud investigation where she says, you know what, never mind. Eventually, she even says, it was an accounting error on my part. There was no fraud.
Right, and so as a result of police looking into the fraud, they see the connection between Young and Pamela Phillips, and that leads them to evidence in Young's van and his activities that turns out he was in Tucson at the time of the Triano murder, and there were sort of signs and elements in evidence that pointed to him being involved in this.
This is one of those, right, where you're thinking about police really don't have a lot of clue on what's going on, and this guy just provides them everything that they need, right? They go into his van. They find documentation and receipts showing that he stayed in a hotel in Tucson in the month leading up to Gary Triano's death, very close to Gary's home, that he has been in contact with Pamela this entire time, and during that time, he has recorded little mini cassettes.
Microcassettes.
Of their
For you
conversations.
kids, those are tapes.
You know what? I'm just aggravated. Will you just leave me alone? Just leave me alone.
I'm bothering you.
Right now you are. I've got to go. I've got kids down at the pool. I have to be back for company at 4
You
for
bothered
Lois's
me
birthday.
for some help with so you get rich. So
Will you leave me alone? Goodbye.
Phillips never admits to committing a crime on these tapes, and she's pleaded not guilty.
when you sit in a women's prison for murder, you're going to be really sad.
I'm going to be back at 4.
No, you're going to be in prison.
He's like an accountant as far as like
meticulous.
The type of paperwork showing that she owed him a $400,000 debt on which she was making regular payments or not regular payments, and that she was struggling with that. It was just a blueprint of motive, of connection, he just gave it to the police, basically.
And then one other aspect of it to really sort of put a cap on everything was the fact that Pamela Phillips had taken out a $2 million life insurance policy on Gary, and despite their divorce, still held that policy. And of course, upon his death, she gets that money paid out to her, and she wasn't doing well financially at the time, and so having that $2 million gives her a whole lot of freedom. And from that $2 million policy come the $400,000 proceeds that go to Ron Young. And so there's this connection. And the phone calls that they had were very interesting because, of course, those come in as evidence in the trial, and we'll get to the legal significance of those things. But those recorded phone calls really are what link the two together and then link the two to the murder. And so, the state's theory then is that Gary is the guy who plants the bomb and pushes the button, killing Mr. Triano. Another thing that I think is important to remember is that Gary, leading up to his death, had made comments and reports about he believed that somebody was following him. And so, all of that then lines perfectly up with Ron being and hanging out there in Tucson, following his movements, watching his habits, going to the golf course, and then planting that bag, setting it off when Gary gets in the car.
Yeah, and then this all takes quite a while. I'm not quite clear on what certain things happened, but it takes quite a while for them to arrest Ronald Young.
Yeah, not till 2008.
Yeah, and then they go to arrest Pamela, and she's on a very long trip to Europe.
That's right.
At the time when the indictment comes down for her.
Police thought they had located her in Switzerland, and then they go to Switzerland, through Interpol or whoever was involved in that, and she's not there. Turns out she's in Austria, which is next door, and
just over the mountain,
right? Yep. That's where they ultimately arrest her. And so Ron is indicted, and Pamela is indicted, and I believe Ron was arrested in Florida. They found him following a doctor's appointment.
They had put him out on America's Most Wanted,
right,
because they just weren't able to track this guy down. Both of them were gone that's what had happened. They actually had the indictment, I think, for 7 years or something like that. Weren't able to find him. Mm-hmm. They put it out on America's Most Wanted. They immediately get a call within 24 hours from a chiropractor who says, "This guy's my patient. but that's not his name, at least to
Yeah,
me.
he's going under a different name, and so
he
they
has
were
an
able-
appointment tomorrow.
Right.
And so they all show up and arrest him. the next day.
Let that be a lesson to you, I guess. Be careful what you share with your doctor, I suppose, if you're involved in car bombings or other
Yes, get
nefarious conduct.
facial reconstruction or something.
But then your plastic surgeon might turn you in. You can't trust anybody these days. What the heck?
What about HIPAA? Come on.
All right, so we then let's shift then into the trial. So Gary goes to trial first, or actually tried. I say Gary, Ron goes to trial first. They're actually tried separately because it's not till much, or well, a little bit later that Pamela is actually arrested in Austria. Ron goes to trial. He's convicted. Pamela later goes to trial. She too is convicted. They're both sentenced to life sentences in prison. One of the stipulations for her extradition, Pamela's extradition, was that she couldn't be charged with the death penalty. The Austria would not relinquish her to the United States unless the state agreed not to pursue the death penalty.
I hadn't seen that. That would be interesting to figure out how that got
It
set
happens.
up.
I've seen it happen on a number of occasions with foreign extraditions. Not every country has the death penalty,
In fact, most do not,
and some,
especially Europe.
right. And so one of the stipulations of her release or her transfer back to the U.S. was you can't put her to death. So
No, they could put that kind of stipulation. on.
yeah. Well, I mean, the foreign country has possession of her, and they don't have to give it up. So,
That's interesting.
Anyway, all right. So let's talk about then some of the legal issues that are raised. We're going to focus mostly on Pamela's, but we can certainly touch on other issues that were raised by Gary. One of the ones
Ronald.
that, gosh dang, what am I going to do to fix that problem? Ronald, not Gary. Gary, unfortunately, was the victim.
Yeah.
Okay. Rule 11. So this was a really interesting situation. We have touched on Rule 11 previously, but what that means is a person, Arizona law requires that a person be found competent or be competent to aid in their defense. And here, for whatever reason, it was discovered or alleged that Pamela was not competent.
And that's unusual. So sometimes people, again, this is one of those misconceptions. We'll talk about a couple of them. That defense attorneys can just say, my client's crazy, right? Or the defendant can just be like, yeah, I've got a microchip in my brain and it controls me, which is actually what she said. And that will, stop the prosecution or something like that. But really what happens is, and this happens to us quite a bit, mental health is a factor in many of our cases. That's okay?
right.
And so whenever we suspect that somebody is not understanding what's happening in their case or not able to assist us in their defense, it's our duty to file. We call it Rule 11. It's really a competency review. And I've thought about why we call it Rule 11. There's not a lot of stuff in court where we just actually refer to it as the rule. And I think maybe because sometimes it can kind of set people off or whatever, where you're saying to the court, I think my client isn't competent, right? And sometimes your client might be, what are you talking about? Of course I'm competent,
So you're
right?
talking code.
So you're talking code. We say,
Judge,
look,
we need a Rule 11
yeah,
evaluation.
and obviously I talk to my client about that first,
Sure.
right? And I'm going to say, look, this is what Rule 11 is. I think we should pursue it because X, Y, and Z. But you do it in court kind of that. I just thought maybe that's why we do it that way. But it's not like the court just says, oh, you think so? Okay. Right? They're
not gonna
crazy.
take your word for it.
So, and we don't know. We're not mental health professionals, right? So what happens is there's a process that the court has to go through in order to make a ruling, because the judge is also not a mental health professional, on whether or not this person is competent to stand trial, right? And so that's done through mental health professionals, where they get sent, depending on the court, depending on the case, to 2 or 3. Generally, right?
Yeah, so 2 doctors will evaluate the defendant. They'll determine 2 things. Are they, number 1, competent? And if they're not competent, number 2 is, can they be restored to competency? Or can they be made or helped to understand the nature of the proceedings against them?
Yeah, so it
the
comes
reason
out-
that they do 2
yeah.
doctors is because they want to get 2 opinions. If those 2 opinions agree with each other, then the person is either going to be determined competent or not competent. and then restored if they're not competent. If the two doctors disagree, a third is appointed as a tiebreaker to solve that puzzle.
And I've just had so many cases where I'm like, my client has no idea what's happening.
Yeah.
And it's just, it puts us in a tough spot because I can't walk my client into a plea agreement that puts them in prison and they have no idea what's
or go
happening.
To trial. They can't be tried if they're not competent.
And so it's a tough situation. And I mean, how many times have you had that where your client is not getting it and they're in a bad way mentally? They go have their evaluation, they're found competent.
Yeah.
I mean, almost always they're found competent. So when they're found not competent, there's usually some pretty legit issues happening.
Yeah, and competency or lack thereof could be, the origin of that could be a number of things. It may be, a mental health problem. It may be something else. They may need medication, something else. In this case, Pamela was not competent, and so she had to go through restoration proceedings, which helped to treat her and bring her to understand the nature of the proceedings against her. And what was really interesting is that apparently her lawyer was interfering with the restoration process. He got in the way, so much so that the court had to issue limitations on his ability to speak with and interact with his client because he was sort of trying to derail the competency.
Never heard of this.
Yeah, never.
Never have I heard of this. And this became kind of the basis of one of their challenges after the trial, right? Is that Pamela and her team brought up the appeal to say, hey, my right to counsel was basically violated because the court put all these restrictions on my lawyer's ability to talk to me. In fact, it says here that they said the attorney was limited just during this restoration phase, and that matters, to 1 hour in-person contact every 30 days and 1 5-minute phone call per week. That's really limiting contact with your counsel.
What was interesting, though, about how the Court of Appeals resolved it was by saying the Rule 11 process is not what they call a critical stage of the case. Trial is a critical stage. Other hearings are critical stages where you must be represented by counsel. When a case is put in Rule 11 proceedings, essentially the case itself is paused while the person is brought back to competency. And so the court resolves this by saying the limitations that were placed on counsel were reasonable, and it's not a critical stage of the case, and so not having a lawyer 24/7 didn't affect the outcome.
Yeah, especially...
So, noble challenge by the appellate team, but the court says, it did not violate her right to counsel.
And they found that especially in this case because that attorney was taken off the team and they lifted those restrictions. That was 1.5 years before trial happened.
Yeah, it wasn't like on the eve of trial and I can't talk to my lawyer. That would have been a different circumstance.
Yeah.
The other issue that was raised on appeal was the limitations that were placed on Pamela's ability to raise a third-party defense. What is a third-party defense? A third-party defense is when you're saying, as the defendant, it wasn't me, but it was someone else. And what a perfect case to raise third-party defenses in this matter, right? Gary Triano created a lot of enemies. He owed a lot of people money. The nature of the murder in the fact that it was a car bomb certainly raised suspicions that a number of people could have done it. The police looked around for a very long time. And so I think it's a fantastic defense to say, hey, Pamela's in Aspen, and all of these guys down in Arizona had an axe to grind against Gary.
Yeah, and we've talked about third-party defenses and how effective they can be, not just because it's a strategy, but because it's important that the state can prove somebody actually committed an act beyond a reasonable doubt.
That's right.
And so having alternative possibilities of who could have committed this offense, it is not on the and we'll talk about kind of the restrictions that the court put on it, but it is not on the defense to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that these other people did it.
Great point.
It is only to raise sufficient questions to say, that's a reasonable doubt that I did it. I don't have to prove who did it. That's the state's job, right? And so that's what's hard about why they're frustrated, I think, in this case, the defense, that they were limited on their ability to point at other people.
But it's not, you can't have a third-party free-for-all either.
Right.
Where you're pointing to any person and bringing in any piece of evidence that you want so that you can say, hey, not me, but 25 other people may have done this thing.
Yeah, and this
now,
is...
you may be able to say 25 other people, but you've got to have some element of proof to say that.
Right, and I think, again, I want to point to another misconception people have about defense attorneys, that this is what they do. That they just say, well, could have been this guy, could have been that guy.
Right,
been, I have no proof, I have no...
Smokescreen.
Yeah, and just, that's what they do. That's what defense attorneys do. The courts put limits on that.
Here's the limit. I think that's a great point. This is directly from the opinion. Asserting a third-party culpability defense does not, as Phillips suggests, require the court to admit all evidence regarding every individual who may have had a motive, means, or opportunity to commit a crime. Vague grounds of suspicion of another do not constitute admissible third-party culpability evidence. Defendant may not, in the guise of third-party culpability defense, simply throw strands of speculation on the wall and see if any of them stick. You've got to have something more than just, hey, what about this guy?
Yeah, and it can be frustrating. We're defense attorneys. We work with our clients who say, but this guy hates me or does this and that. And you're like, oh, okay, well, tell me about, what experiences have you had? What contact with them? Well, no, I just know it. I just know they hate me. Or, there's just nothing that can be pointed at or proven as a piece of evidence to show this person's motive or whatever, right?
Yeah, and sometimes there's not admissible evidence to come in to show those things. It may be based on a hearsay statement or something else that otherwise can't be admitted in a trial. And so not just the third-party hurdle, but just evidence in general. There may not be the ability to prove those things.
Yeah.
Now here, the court did allow a wide variety of third-party culpability evidence to come in. Specific folks who had an axe to grind against Gary was admitted. Now, not everything came in, and that's based on rules of evidence and other considerations. But Pamela's defense was able to point the finger at others and say, not Pamela, it must have been somebody else. And so that does raise in the jury's mind potential reasonable doubt that the defense can argue in closing and say, Pamela was in Aspen, Colorado. This other person or that person, Gary owed them money, and so they had the means, they had the motive, they had the opportunity. The one fellow who had some mafia ties, well, certainly the mob has been known to blow up a car or two, right? So it's a good defense strategy, but people need to understand that there's limitations to it.
Yeah, great point. And I think that, especially I would think it's effective in a case like this. And maybe we'll talk about it. It's another one of her complaints or challenges to the case in the appeals court is that this was a purely circumstantial case.
I love that.
Right?
Let's dive in on that right now.
Okay.
So let me we've talked about this, I know, in a previous episode, but let's just reiterate the idea. What is direct evidence? What is circumstantial evidence? Direct evidence is something that directly proves a fact. Let's say an eyewitness sees something. That is direct evidence. They're saying, I saw the guy shoot the other guy. That's direct evidence. Circumstantial evidence is evidence that requires you to make a connection, right? For instance, I think when we talked about Winnie Ruth Judd, right? The fact that the murders were carried out nearby. She took the train back to a nearby location, which was her home. Things that are in and around the murder that would give rise to the idea that, hey, this person could have done it. But it requires a leap. You have to draw a conclusion from another fact, and it's not direct. And so
that's this whole case.
That's this entire case.
Yeah.
All of these little pieces, nobody saw Ron Young push the button and blow up the car. Nobody saw Pamela contract with Ron to carry these things out. But there was circumstantial proof. The hotel receipt.
They can prove he was there at that time. They can't even prove that he bought those bomb pieces, right? That would be even more direct, but that's still even circumstantial.
So circumstantial.
But it's not even that direct, right? It's just that he was in that city, which he otherwise apparently has no connection to.
Right, and then think about things like the insurance policy, right? Another piece of circumstantial evidence. Look, my wife has life insurance on me, right? Does that mean that she's going to murder me?
I sure hope not.
We never know. One doesn't know. But
If we've learned anything,
right
in this,
if
you get
moves,
murdered,
if she moves to Aspen, Colorado, anyway, that's the idea, right? There's pieces of evidence from which you have to draw other inferences. Now, does the law in Arizona today distinguish between direct and circumstantial evidence? No. Jurors are given the instruction at a trial. Evidence may be direct, it may be circumstantial. There's no legal difference between the two of them. The only thing that matters for the jury is they get to decide what weight to give to each piece of evidence. They decide how important it might be. So
I hate it. I hate it so much. Yeah, I hate it because it tricks. I think it's misleading to a jury.
why do you say that?
To say that it's the same. And you might say legally, but you're saying it's the same. And it's not the same. It's not as clear of proof to me. It is not as powerful of proof to say he was in the same location at the same time as the guy who died than to say I saw him push the button.
But are
Those are not the same.
Are you demanding then that cases be made based on direct evidence alone?
I'm not. What I'm saying is it's misleading to tell a jury that it's the same. Because what they're trying to do is they're trying to decide, like you said, does it get me to beyond a reasonable doubt? And those might be different based on direct or indirect evidence.
Sure, but that does give the jury, though, the freedom to say, what is enough circumstantial proof? If I have two pieces of circumstantial evidence and that's it in a given case, is that proof beyond a reasonable doubt? I don't know. What if I have 12?
Right.
Okay? You're saying, jury, we trust you with the ability to weigh and balance this evidence as you see fit. Certainly, a circumstantial case does give the defense more leeway to argue that the proof is insufficient, as opposed to direct evidence where, now you're arguing, for instance, just credibility of the witness. Did the guy see what he says he saw? Or authenticity of a surveillance video that shows the murder or something
or a document,
like that. Yeah. So I get your point, but I think it then relates back to the jury system itself. Do we trust juries to make the right decision? I don't know, but I can't think of a better way to do it.
Yeah, and that's the other piece I really struggle with, right, as a defense attorney, is what we call burden of proof, right? When we're talking about types of evidence that get us beyond a particular burden of proof, right? And I don't know if we've covered this before, but different types of things require different burdens of proof. And we don't really decide stuff in our everyday life like that, right? So for instance, right, and this is a common defense attorney thing to talk about, right? In order to arrest somebody, you need probable cause, which is a pretty low standard. You need to have reasonable basis to believe that this thing happened, right? What are the next ones? You got preponderance of the evidence, right? Which is...
That's in a civil case, 50-50.
That's kind of how you make decisions in everyday life.
Right. Do I want the steak or the chicken?
Yeah, I slightly want the steak more, right? 51%, right? Then there's other burdens of proof like clear and convincing evidence, which is higher. You have to have a higher level of proof. Really, it has to be uneven towards the proof level, Then there's beyond a reasonable doubt, which is very high, right? You have to be able to prove that there's no reasonable doubt. And the way that I wish I'd brought the jury instruction where it says it doesn't mean to remove every single doubt.
Yeah.
It means to leave the jury firmly convinced.
Yeah, proof beyond a reasonable doubt does not have to overcome every doubt.
Yeah,
right.
It's tough.
What it is as you said, the instruction says, proof beyond a reasonable doubt is proof that leaves you firmly convinced of the defendant's guilt.
Right. And I just feel like you want to say to a jury, if you go in there, the question is not, do you think he did it? That's not the question.
That's right.
Right? Because that's how we normally make decisions in life, and that's not how a criminal case works. It has to be, did the state prove every element of every offense beyond any reasonable doubt?
But that is on the defense lawyer.
It's true.
The
I'm
defense lawyer has to go in there prepared and say, ladies and gentlemen, this is a purely circumstantial case. There's no direct proof that this even happened or that my client did this thing that they said. You have, the state trying to convince you with piece A, B, C, D, and E, but what about all of these other possibilities? And, link that to now the third-party defense, and I think it becomes even stronger, right? Where you say, not only is there just circumstantial proof, but there's also a dozen other people who wanted this guy's head, right? Now, I think that's a great segue into probably the most damning piece of evidence that the state had, which was some recorded phone calls that our friend Ron had taped in his conversations with Pamela, and the state played those calls, and they discussed the payment for essentially a dirty deed that he later one time said, if this gets out, you're going to prison for murder to Pamela.
And she says, so are you.
So are you, right? Okay, so...
That was the closest thing to a confession. Sometimes it gets billed that there was a taped confession, right? In this case, not the case. But could you conclude from that that's what they were talking about?
Right, so you take this circumstantial proof that existed, and then you put the tape on top of that where he says, you're going to prison for murder. She says, so are you. And then,
what?
Does that...
Why? Why would you go to
Why
prison
would you
for-
say that? She didn't, of course,
Didn't say that. How dare you?
Murder? Of whom?
What are you talking
Right.
about?
That, I think, seals the deal for the state, right? Now, the question that was raised was, how do those recorded calls come in as evidence? How could Ron get away with recording a phone call that Pamela wasn't aware of? And the court analyzes that question. The simple answer is, in Arizona, we are a one-party consent state. So if you and I are on a phone call, as long as I am aware of the recording, I can record our phone calls. You do not need to be aware of the phone call, okay?
I always love that. One-party consent. I was like, of course that person knows
Of course
it's
they
being
do.
recorded.
But the one-party consent calls are used all the time.
Yeah.
Police use them in particular in sex cases, issues of child molestation or sexual assault, where the defendant, the suspect is known. They'll get the accused or the suspect on the phone, and, let's say it's the victim calling the suspect, why did you do those things to me?
I just need to hear
want
you say
some
you're
closure.
sorry.
I just want, that type of recorded phone call can be very, very damning because they say, okay, yeah, but it was just the one time or whatever. I mean, what's a jury going to do with that?
Yeah.
But conclude that this occurred. So Pamela raises the issue of the recorded phone call, but it's resolved essentially because the law allowed for a one-party consent recording. Now, it does raise the issue of sort of co-conspirator hearsay between the two of them, but there's rules that allow for that as well. And so that piece of evidence, becomes very difficult.
Yeah, we don't want to get too deep into the rules of hearsay, but basically the co-conspirator, it's not hearsay at all if it's, recorded by the co-conspirator. It's kind of like if, you get caught with something, in your wallet or whatever that implicates the guy next to you, he can't then say you were illegally searched.
Right, because there's not a grounds for it.
Yeah.
To the extent that you're being investigated, don't ever discuss things over the phone.
Come on.
Text messages.
Rule number one.
Honestly, go back to what we say in all of our videos. Don't talk to the police. Don't talk to your co-conspirator. I mean, gosh.
Yeah, where do we see it today? Online.
Online.
Social
everywhere.
media.
Totally.
That's where we see
Totally.
it now. Yeah.
All right, last issue, and then we'll kind of close this out. One of the issues that Ron raised was the question of pre-indictment delay. They were on to Ron not too long after the murders occurred, based on that fraud investigation and other things, but it did take years for that to develop. Ron is not indicted until 2008, 12 years after the murder. Ron raises the issue, well, you had enough evidence at least to charge me years earlier. Why didn't you? And that delay harmed me. It harmed my defense. And that's a common scenario. At least it's common enough.
You've won cases based on that.
Well, not on pre-indictment delay.
Post-indictment delay.
Post-indictment delay for the defense is easier. The difficulty with pre-indictment delay is that the defense has to show actual prejudice. You've got to show, really, that the state intentionally delayed this and you suffered some irreparable harm in your defense. And frankly, Ron just wasn't able to sufficiently argue those things because there wasn't enough prejudice. And so at the end of the day, Ron gets convicted, Pamela gets convicted. They're both sentenced to life. And, I guess it puts the end to a really long, drawn-out saga. 1996.
18 years for her to get found and convicted.
Yeah, long time. And, like we said in the beginning, a sensational murder based on the method of the homicide.
Yeah, and I did hear a little anecdote about when this did happen. His ex-wife was there. His children were there, who had been waiting, a long time for this. And some people kind of had tried to cast dispersions on him because of stuff that was involved in his life. Did the guy deserve to be murdered? Of course not. And so he was a loved guy. A lot of people loved Gary Triano, and really a sad case that we see, unfortunately, with many of these cases that we do. It's the person closest to them, or at least an ex-spouse who does that.
Yeah, and one thing I read was that when Pamela was found guilty at the sentencing, defendant gets an opportunity to speak, she said over and over, "I did not do this. I am innocent." Interesting.
Yeah, and
jury thought differently.
I just want everybody to know that I am innocent. I am innocent. I am innocent. Okay? And I'm really, really, this is hard. It's so hard for me. It's a nightmare.
Yeah, and interesting, she gets convicted on 2 counts, right?
Murder and conspiracy.
First degree. So it's like, wow, how do you get convicted of murder if you're also convicted of the conspiracy? Because the conspiracy is about, planning it with somebody else even if they carry it out. But the interesting piece, you can also be convicted of murder itself if you are an accomplice to somebody else committing it.
Yeah, and accomplice means you provide aid, opportunity, means other aspects. And certainly, she must have done those things, right? She probably could lay out Gary's routine, his itinerary, give Ron the ability to go and track him down and do those things. So, again, interesting case, great discussion. Appreciate you.
Absolutely.
Let's do this again soon.
All right.
Okay.